All right, for those of you who are coming in, welcome. This is our CrimCon panel at 12 noon Eastern. My name is Dr. Brianna Beaupre, also known as Bree. Thank you for coming. I am an assistant professor at Wichita State, and I'm also a board member for CrimCon. And this is our first ever virtual conference. We're super excited about it. We've had over 300 presenters. So that means panels. Individual presentations. So it's been a really exciting day with lots of fantastic presentations. And so just some things to be aware of as attendees. We'll be proceeding in the order of the conference program. Each presenter will have 10 minutes. And when you have questions, please type them in the Q&A. I'll read them out loud at the end for panelists to answer. And this is what it should look like on your end. So you'll want to go to this Q&A right here. And remember to have fun. We created CrimCon to be a more fun and accessible and inclusive alternative. And so thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelist for this panel titled Issues Concerning Recidivism.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Raquel Oliveira, and I'm trying to share my screen with you. Hopefully I'll be able to do it without much of a fuss. So can you guys see the presentation? Yeah, yes. Thank you.
Looks great, yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. All right, so today I will be presenting on a part of my dissertation project that was supervised by Kevin Beaver at FSU, and I'll be focusing on a subsection on assault and battery offenders, specifically on their typologies and recidivism. Now, it's not moving. One of the questions that I received when I started doing this project was, why are you doing typologies? There are hundreds of typologies out there, and that's absolutely true. There are tons of typologies out there, but once you start actually dwelling into that literature, you find that only a few of them were developed empirically, being that most are older, based on anecdotes or small-scale observations that were not that systematic. So scientifically, there is still a need to develop good typologies. And then on top of that, most of the typologies that exist actually focus just on high-profile crimes, such as murder or severe sex crimes, and not exactly on assault, battery, or other types of crimes. In addition to that, the really good typologies that we have out there, they use a lot of psychometric scales, motivational scales, personality scales, and these require specialized training to be able to use and actually apply, which makes it limited to a very restricted audience. And most of the criminal justice actors that could actually use these typologies to better focus programming or needs or follow-up after release cannot actually use them because they do not have the training to be able to use psychometric instruments. And then finally, in terms of assault and battery specifically, there are not those many typologies out there, and the ones that exist are just limited to domestic violence. And they don't really focus on how these can help predict recidivism or educational training or anything. So our study actually aimed at tackling some of these gaps in the literature by exploring typologies of aggravated assault and battery offenders, seeing if these typologies help predict recidivism, and do this by using criminal justice data that is more accessible to criminal justice actors. So to this end, I used what we call the recidivism file. It was a file compiled by several FSU researchers using data from the Florida Department of Corrections, the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and the Florida Department of Revenue. And it has a really large cohort of around 250,000 offenders that were incarcerated in the state of Florida. And out of these, around 58,000 were violent offenders, and 17,500 were charged with assault and battery. The data was collected between 2004 and 2011, and it has a follow-up period for recidivism of 5 years. In terms of the data analysis to explore the typologies, I opted for a latent class analysis, and I explored between 2 and 10 class solutions. And then I selected the best class solution based on fit, interpretability, and parsimony of the models. After that, I used logistic regressions to explore if there was an association between class membership and recidivism. And if there was an association, then I used a survival analysis with Cox proportional hazard models to predict the hazard in time to recidivism. So in brief, in terms of the typologies, these were the 10 class solutions explored for the aggregation of offenders into different types. And even though we can see that the 10 class solution had the lowest indices for most of the indicators used, it was not parsimonious, it was not interpretable, there was a lot of overlap between classes. So after exploring quite a bit, I opted for a 6 class solution, which made a lot more sense theoretically and in terms of practical applications. And this is what the 6 classes actually look like. I'm not going to go into too much detail because there's quite a bit here, but in terms of the distinctions between classes, there was some difference in terms of gender composition, being that classes 1, 3, and 4 had a higher representation of females compared to other classes and compared to the general sample of violent offenders that I studied. In terms of the employment status, there were also some differences. We see that individuals in class 1 and class 3 were mostly unemployed. Also regarding mental health, we see that individuals in class 1 and 4 had a very strong prevalence of mental health diagnosis. This was over 90% of the individuals in those samples. And in class 4 specifically, this was strongly associated with substance use, substance abuse, and having committed the crime under the influence of any type of substance. In addition to that, it seems that there has been quite a bit of variability in terms of their criminal careers. And by criminal careers, we only had access to prior convictions. So this has to do with more severe criminal career history. And we see that, for example, in classes 1, 5, and 6, the prior history was of about 7 to 8 prior convictions in the state of Florida, which is dramatically different from those individuals in classes 2 and 3, where they had between 1 and 2 on average prior convictions. This also impacted the types of crime committed. Those that committed less crimes on average tended to be more specialized and focused more on violent crimes, whereas those that had longer criminal careers, as expected, were more generalists and had offended above and beyond violent offendings and assaults. In terms of the recidivism rates, when we looked at it, they seemed to vary a little bit as well, but we wanted to explore if there was actually a significant variation between these recidivism rates. So for that, I used logistic regressions, and class membership effectively did predict significant differences in recidivism at years 1, 3, and 5 of the follow-up period, not for year 4 though. And the most significant predictors were age, sex, prison misconduct, substance abuse treatment, visitation, and receiving post-prison supervision. After this, I moved along to the survival analysis, and before actually doing the models, I compared the survival curves of all 6 classes, and as they presented significant differences, it made sense to move on with the analysis. So rather than showing you all the analysis because it's too much, I made a summary table of the significant relationships observed. So we see that in these classes, age, sentence length, and visitation, for the most part, seem to have a negative association with the hazard of recidivism. So they tend to decrease as age increases, as sentence length increases, and as the number of visits increases, there seems to be a lower hazard of recidivism for these offenders. And then for sex, prison misconduct, and post-prison supervision, I observed the opposite relationship. So males were more likely or had a higher hazard of recidivism. Those that had more prison misconduct events also had a higher risk of recidivism. And those that received post-prison supervision, specifically in classes 2, 3, and 5, also seemed to be at a higher hazard for recidivism, which might have to do with the simple fact that they are being more supervised than the others. So in short, what we found is that different classes seem to help predict recidivism for aggravated assault and battery offenders. The hazard of recidivism is impacted by different variables, and the consistent predictors throughout the different classes seem to be associated with age, sex, sentence length, prison misconduct, visitation, and post-prison supervision. So just what we found in the logistic regression models as well. In terms of implications, there are quite a few to be discussed, but I find that these 2 are the most relevant at this stage. We are so focused in allocating programming and trying to rehabilitate offenders that a lot of the studies that have been done, especially regarding educational and vocational programming in Florida, have actually shown that they have significant positive effects. So they decrease recidivism. We didn't find that in the sample at all. So in general, there was no effect whatsoever on recidivism by participating in educational and vocational programming. And that might have to do, on the one hand, with the sample, of course, but then on the other, with this approach of a one-size-fits-all type of training, and in a lack of approaching potentially more employable skills. And there are obviously selection issues that we could not control for because we do not have access to the selection criteria for participating in programs. On top of that, as far as we know, these were the first criminal justice derived typologies focused specifically on aggravated assault and battery. So they might be more widely applied than those that were developed with psychometric scales. This being said, of course, the study has its limitations. It uses criminal justice data based on incarcerated offenders. So we all know that that's a limitation because it doesn't really reach the full span of offenders. There is no information on the victims specifically in terms of their age, characteristics, etc. We just have information about domestic violence or not. And there is no information on crime characteristics, specifically if they were committed with a weapon or not, if there was co-offending included or not. And in terms of the recidivism measure, we used re-imprisonment for any reason. And as there was no specific information on a specific crime, which limits as well, because it would be interesting to know if they were recidivated with the same type of crime, different types of crime, if it was for a technical violation or not, and we did not have access to that type of information. And that's all for now. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Next panelist. Great.
Can everyone see it okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our presentation on matching needs with services for reducing recidivism in the juvenile drug court. My name is Tori Rodriguez, and I'm a graduate student at Southeastern Louisiana University. This research was made possible with the collaboration of myself, Molly Okrepke, Dr. William Chernoff, Dr. Lisa Olson, and Dr. Michael Bisciglia. So the juvenile drug courts were developed in response to public fear of juvenile delinquency and the court's ineffective sentencing. Between the years of 1988 and 1997, drug courts saw a 125% increase in drug law violations. Since the adult drug courts were a seemingly effective solution for individuals with substance involvement, a juvenile model was created with adjustments made for juvenile needs. Within the literature, evidence supporting the effectiveness of juvenile drug courts has remained mixed. Mixed results could be the result of a deeper problem in the juvenile court system, which is the inaccurate matching of youths to the correct services and programs depending on their needs.
Okay, so we're really interested in this idea of matching services to needs. So to kind of give that I guess you could say a theoretical framework, we drew on the work of the risk, needs, and responsivity model proposed by Taylor. So effectively, it's the idea that youth have specific needs that get them involved within the juvenile justice system. And if we're really going to provide them with effective services, then we need to be able to identify those needs and then match them with the correct services for what it is they're trying to work through. When it comes to this idea about matching, we identified 6 hypotheses, and really they can be broken down into 3 sections. So the first 2 hypotheses, these are your hypotheses that basically argue, if you take a youth, if you identify their needs, and you provide them with the services that are most consistent with those needs, then the recidivism is going to be a lot lower. The second 2 hypotheses, so hypotheses 3 and 4, these are the hypotheses about mismatching. So again, the idea that if you have a youth and you give them services that are not consistent with their needs, then they're going to be more likely to recidivate. And then the final 2 hypotheses, these are your more conventional juvenile drug court hypotheses. So a lot of the juvenile drug court literature has been strongly focused on the question of, well, are juvenile drug courts better than conventional services or not. So here we explore the idea of, well, if you've got youth who are well-matched and one are well-matched with juvenile drug court services versus conventional diversion services, is there going to be a difference? And then also the idea of, well, if they're mismatched, is there going to be a difference there as well? So in order to examine these hypotheses, we drew a sample of data from a large Midwestern juvenile court between January 1st, 2012 and December 31st, 2015. So the sample size consisted of 1,198 diverted youth, and these youth were either diverted to traditional diversion services or drug court services. To analyze these data, we used a Cox proportional hazards regression, and then once we identified a statistically significant interaction effect, we examined that interaction effect further using pairwise comparisons and Tukey's honest significant difference. So here are the variables for our model. So when it came to our dependent variable, we focused on recidivism. So there's the binary yes, no, do they recidivate? And then we also have the number of days until recidivism. We also have our study variables. So these are the variables that we really are focused on the most. And that's treatment type. So these youth either received juvenile drug court services or they received traditional diversion services. Now, when it came to these youth, they either had some record of alcohol or drugs, or they didn't. So we're interested in the relationship between the study variables on our dependent variable. Now, when it comes to recidivism, there are a number of legal variables as well as extra legal variables that affect that process. So we included those in our model to take them into account. So here we have a table, and this table shows 3 columns. So each column is for each of our 3 different models. The first column shows just the study variables and how those correlate with the likelihood of recidivism. The second column takes into account the legal variables, and the third column takes into account the legal variables as well as the extra legal variables. Now, a number of these relationships appear to be statistically significant, but the ones I really want to draw your attention to are down at the bottom. So what we see here is that regardless of legal variables and extra legal variables, the interaction effect between treatment type and substance involvement was statistically significant across all 3 models. So to further understand the relationship between the study variables and recidivism while controlling for legal and extra legal variables, we calculated estimated marginal log odds of recidivism. So if you're familiar with say a two-way ANOVA, this is what this plot basically shows while controlling for those legal and extra legal variables. So the first statistically significant result we found had to do with youth who had a history of drugs and alcohol. And what we see is that when it comes to these youth, if we can get these youth to have juvenile drug court services, then they are far less likely to recidivate than youth who received traditional diversion services. We also see that when it comes to youth who don't have any substance involvement history, that giving them traditional diversion services, that they are less likely to recidivate than if you're to give them, say, juvenile drug court services. Now, looking at that first column, here we can compare how it is that traditional court services affect these youth. And we see that if you are talking about youth who have no substance involvement, they're the least likely to recidivate, while the youth that have some drug and alcohol needs, that they're the most likely to recidivate. And similar, we see the opposite effect when we talk about the drug court services. So if you have youth who have drug and alcohol needs, they're the least likely to recidivate, while those who don't have substance involvement are the most likely to recidivate. Now, when it came to those more conventional hypotheses about how the juvenile drug court services compared to traditional diversion services, we didn't find a statistically significant difference between the youth who received the traditional court services or the juvenile drug court services. So here's the situation where the youth were matched correctly. Here's the situation where they were not matched correctly. And again, we just didn't have enough evidence to say that these differences exist.
So explanations for our results are not clear-cut, but with the use of some prior literature, we're able to make some likely assumptions. So our results show that incorrectly matched services result in higher recidivism rates. When correctly matched, juveniles with a history of substance involvement may recidivate less due to having properly assigned supervision and resources, whereas individuals not assigned to drug court may suffer from having their needs unmet. Juveniles without a history of substance involvement could be more successful in traditional court settings due to the program's ability to target their particular issues and teach them appropriate coping mechanisms. And then juveniles who are assigned to drug court who do not have a history of substance involvement may suffer due to over-servicing and incorrect resources. And this kind of highlights the question, why are youths without a history of substance involvement even assigned to drug courts? And one possible answer is that drug courts may be used as a last resort option when juveniles haven't been successful in other programs. Another possibility is that judges may assign drug court when the juvenile's family or peers have a history of being involved in drugs, implementing a birds of a feather mentality. So our study does face some limitations, such as the fact that it was a non-experimental design. Therefore, it's possible that other explanations exist. Also, this study only incorporated one juvenile court, so the results may vary in other jurisdictions. Future research would need to be conducted in order to examine the decision-making process used when matching juveniles to court programs. And additionally, we need better tools in identifying the needs of particular juveniles. And that is all that we have for you today. And thank you so much for tuning into our presentation.
Awesome, thank you. I'll turn it over to our third panelist now.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think maybe
Okay.
you're on mute. You could click play from start and it should work.
All right.
It's on the, yeah, right there.
All right. Thank you so much. So I'm Abigail from the University of Calgary, a first-year student in the PhD sociology program. And I'm presenting on diversion program. So this is actually my findings from a paper that I wrote while doing my master program in University of Windsor. So it's just a qualitative review of current studies on diversion programs. So between the year 2010 to 2020. So my context, youth crimes is a very pressing social problem now. And so countries try to find like ways to deal with this issue. And one of the most popular method that has been adopted by various countries, most especially developed nations, is the diversion program. So a study conducted by Olson in 2012 found that there was a disproportionate number of crimes in Canada. Number of crimes in Canada, and these crimes were mostly committed by the youth. So in comparison with like older adults, most of the crimes that were committed in Canada were like committed by youth. And then the rates between 12 to 17, that was also another study conducted by Moreau in 2019. And he found that twice people were accused of an offense in 2014 were twice as high as the rate for those above 24. So that means that youth were committing more crimes than adults. Now, what are diversion programs? They are programs that offer young offenders the opportunity to be directed away from the traditional justice system, while holding them accountable for their actions. So in as much as we are diverting you, you still be accountable for your actions. Whatever crime you've committed, you'll still be held accountable. The goals of this program is to provide access to the appropriate training or treatment service essential to enable offenders to correct their behavior. So basically just to reduce the offending rate among young offenders. And then it is also to reduce youth involvement in the criminal justice system. The other goal of this program is to limit unnecessary social control, that is to limit how the state interferes in the affair of youth. And then this is actually another goal which is usually not mentioned, but then it's also actually to reduce the cost that is associated with the formal processing of offenders. Compared to being sentenced, studies have found that when people are diverted into community programs and things, like it's less costly for the criminal justice system. So they try to do this to reduce the cost. Now, there are two types of diversion programs. We have the formal diversion program and we have the informal diversion program. Now, with the formal diversion program, what happens is that you are brought before the court and then you plead guilty, you accept that you committed the offense, and then you are diverted into a program. So basically accepting that you are guilty of the offense and then going into an intervention program, like community service, they have therapeutic programs as well. And then with the informal one, it could also be in the form of just cautioning and release. An example of such offenses could just be like violating a traffic offense. So the police could just caution you and then set you free. Or in some instance, you don't go to the court, but then you are also referred to an intervention program. What happens is that these two diversion programs, we have two levels of intervention for these two programs. So youth can be referred at two criminalized status. That is the pre-charge referrals and then the post-charge referrals. With the pre-charge, you actually not charged. You are just referred into the program and then you undertake some activities, and after completing the activities, you're just released. But if you fail to complete the activities, then you can be taken to the court and then you can be charged with the offense. With the post-charge, you're actually charged, and then after the charge, the prosecutor actually refer you into the program. Now, as mentioned earlier, some of the intervention programs found in this diversion program include therapeutic interventions, which includes counseling. Sometimes they also help these individuals with some employment training so as to help them divert from such criminal activities. And then we have restorative programs, and we also have like volunteering mentoring programs. So volunteering, most of the times they take these young offenders to go do some community activities to clean up and all that. Now, who gets diverted? There have been a lot of contentions concerning people who actually get the opportunity to participate in this program. And what are the guidelines that prosecutors or police use in diverting young offenders? Actually, there hasn't been any criteria, like we don't have any criteria, but then some studies have actually found that there are some factors that actually influence the police or the prosecutor's decision to divert. Now, some of these factors include the nature of the type of the offense or the offender's criminal history. So if you have like minor issues, you're likely to get you're likely to get diverted. If you're a first-time offender accused of a minor crime, you're also likely to be diverted into this program. Also, they've also found out that the gender is actually very influential in the decision to divert. So more girls are more likely to get diverted compared to boys. Some studies have also found that the race and then the place of residence also count. So people who are found in rural areas are less likely to be diverted, and then white people are more likely to be diverted compared to Black people. Also, situational factors play a key role in this decision to divert, and that includes the youth's attitude and sometimes the possession of weapon. So if the youth actually shows some behavior which is not acceptable, the police is more likely to sentence them or charge them. And if they actually put on a good behavior, they are more likely to be diverted. Also, if you are found in possession of maybe drugs, weapons, you are more likely to be charged than to be diverted. And because there are actually no proper guidelines pertaining to who gets diverted, it results in inconsistencies, because the police or the prosecutor just use their discretions to refer youth into these programs. Why do we need to divert offenders? Now, studies have shown that justice involvement may affect life opportunities. So you see that if you have a criminal record, or even if that criminal record did not result in a sentence or a conviction, more employers are not likely to hire you. Also, it tends to affect your academic successes. So that is the reason why we tend to divert young offenders, just so it doesn't affect their life opportunities. Also, the justice system involvement may increase their risk or likelihood at reoffending. And this has actually been proven by the labeling theorists, who say that labeling people as deviant or delinquent would actually increase their likelihood of reoffending as they internalize these labels and take on the attributes of that label. So telling somebody that they are deviant or delinquent, they actually try to act in that manner. And also, involvement with the criminal justice system exposes them to more advanced delinquent youth. So if you sentence them or you charge them, they are more likely to meet people who have like more criminogenic attitude, and then they are more likely to learn from them and act in that manner. Examining effectiveness. Now, a widely accepted indicator in assessing efficiency of an intervention or program is recidivism. So most of the studies conducted on diversion, on the effectiveness of diversion, have used recidivism as a measure to assess the effectiveness of this program. So if the program is able to reduce the offending rate among young offenders, then it's deemed as effective. Also, the main objective of diversion program is to get young offenders away from the justice system. So it will be deemed effective if the number of times young offenders come into contact with the police is reduced. Now, this was my key finding. So youth who completed the diversion program were less likely to re-offend compared to those who did not complete or participate in the program. So there are three groups here. There are people who didn't get opportunity to participate. There are people who got opportunity to participate. And there are people who got opportunity to participate and did not complete. So if you participated in the program, you are more likely to not re-offend. Those who did not participate at all are more likely to offend. So that was my finding. The other finding was that the pre-charge program were more effective in reducing recidivism than the post-charge program. And this finding is actually inconsistent with the claims made by the labeling theories that when people get in contact with the criminal justice, or when the youths get in contact with the criminal justice, they are more likely to re-offend. The other one that I found was that specific program characteristics have desirable impact on program outcomes. So the coordination of parents or guidance in this program actually helped the young offenders to actually complete the program, and this in turn helps them to reduce their rate of re-offending. Okay. Another one was that factors such as the participants' level of risk, the agency sponsoring the program, and the research design actually influence the program's effectiveness. So most of the studies had most of the programs had like different designs. There were some that had like more programs, actually they had programs that actually address the specific needs of the individuals. There are some with less programs. So all this actually contributes to the effectiveness of the program. So if the program has more program, like if the diversion program has like therapeutic, they have mentoring, they have all this, then they are able to actually test the needs of the young offender and actually assign them to the right program, that way addressing their criminogenic needs. So those actually are also factors that influence the effectiveness of diversion program. And then people with low level of risk are actually more likely to complete the program and not to reoffend compared to those who are of high level, like their risk level is high. So this is my consideration and conclusion. There is a need to identify the factors that actually prevent some youth from participating or completing the diversion program. That way, policymakers should actually establish a formal procedure in referring you to this program. So there will be a clear-cut guideline as to who is actually qualified to go into the program or who is not qualified. So that, I mean, policemen and prosecutors will not just use their discretion to refer these individuals into the program. And then there should be also a consistency across the programs because there are variation in the program designs. There are some that are just post-charge, there are some that are just pre-charge, and actually also the interventions in the program are actually varied. Different programs with different interventions. Another thing is that the duration of the follow-up should be extensive. We realize that some of the articles that I looked at, there are some that the follow-up was just a year, there were some that were 3 years. So if it's extensive, we are actually able to know if this youth reoffended or did not reoffend. And then there is a need for additional research. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So now I will open it up to Q&A. So attendees, you're welcome to ask your questions in the Q&A and I'll read them out verbally. I can ask a question for each of you. So what was the most surprising or interesting finding from your studies?
I can go first. I think I was expecting a little bit more of an impact of the educational and vocational training, especially with the groups of unemployed, with the classes that ended up with unemployment or that were younger offenders. I had expected that to some extent, you know, if they haven't finished school and they still get educational training, or if they get skilled vocational training, that it would have an impact, especially with my class 3, which the average age was 21. So we had a lot of 18 and 17-year-olds in there. And it had no impact, zero. It wasn't significant at all. It wasn't even marginally significant. So I think that was the one thing that I was really surprised by. And it does speak a bit to this massive difference of what is done in programs with juveniles, where there is a lot of focus in treatment and education and all of that, and then a complete neglect of how programming is done to adults, where it's more of that one-size-fits-all approach. Doesn't mean that it's always that, but in many situations, then it ends up being that type of an approach.
Oh, so I guess can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So I guess when it came to the findings, you know, what was really most surprising? I mean, I think some of the things were more just the factors that didn't appear to be statistically significant. So I was really hoping to be able to weigh in on that debate of just, you know, the conventional, you know, is our juvenile drug court services better than diversion ones? And you know, all things considered, we really just didn't have the evidence to say that. So, you know, we end up with this other takeaway, which it just sort of seems to be, you know, just if you have the youth and you can figure out their needs, and if you can give them the right services, then, you know, that's really the best thing for them. So we kind of get this conclusion that it's not so much about, you know, which one is better, and just more the idea that the juvenile court has options. And it's really about, you know, making sure that each youth gets the correct option for their needs.
Great. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now that we have a few questions in. I want to make sure we get to audience questions. So Abigail, did you talk to young people in your research?
No. So this was basically like a review of current research. So it didn't involve any interviews or any, it's just a secondary data. So.
Nick asks, are there other factors contributing to child delinquency completion? Oh, sorry, divergent completion.
So like factors that actually contribute to they completing their program. So the ones that I found were like involvement of their guidance in the program. An interesting one that I saw was that there was one study that mentioned that actually volunteers in the program had the discretion to impose certain factors, which tends to hinder the completion of the program by these offenders. So they could do whatever they want to do to these young offenders. But basically the factors that helped them complete was guardian involvement and then getting like the right resources that actually match their risk need.
Great. Another question, also wondering who ran the diversion programs, the voluntary sector or police, both? Thanks. And thanks to everyone for sharing your research.
So for those running the programs, that was what I mentioned. There are kind of inconsistencies in running of this program. There are some that are being run by the courts. There are some that are just being run by the communities. And then we have some non-profit-making organizations that have some of these programs, like the John Howard Society. That's how like they run diversion programs as well. So, yeah.
Great. We have some questions in the chat too. Let's see. Okay. Can you make minors complete the program? What if they refuse?
So I think I did not mention this, but yes, they can refuse not to participate in this program. So they have the option to decide whether they would go into this program or not. And usually refusal to go into the program means that you actually be charged for that crime. So.
Oh, okay. Because not all youth are given the opportunity to have alternative measures because racism is another barrier for youth in Canada. I think that was more of a comment. Yeah. Okay. We got some commentary going on here. Any other questions you'd like me to ask the panelists? I'll give it, another minute, and then if not, we will go ahead and wrap up. So if you have any other questions, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A. Panelists, you're also welcome to ask each other questions if you like. We have about 7 minutes left.
So Abigail, I was wondering, when it comes to the youth that receive the pre-charges, so it kind of seems like the pre-charge is meant to take the place of an official charge. So if the youth completes the program, does the juvenile court still keep a record of pre-charges?
No. So the records are taken off. Once you're able to go through all the requirements, your records are taken off.
And is that kind of we seal the record, or is it if the youth goes back to the court knows?
So the record is actually sealed, so that record does not exist. Once the person is able to complete the program, the record is taken off. So it's actually sealed.
Anything else?
I can go ahead. William or Tori, your presentation was really, really interesting. I found it really curious. And I put a comment before. I'm really curious about that possible study you guys mentioned at the end of going into the motivations and decision-making process about throwing youths into regular court and diversion programs and then into drug courts. And I was not aware that there was the possibility of youths that are not involved in any type of substance use being tried, so to speak, in a drug court. I'm really curious about what goes behind that. I mean, I understand when the parents might have a substance abuse problem, but is that the only scenario that is actually happening? Or is it like, oh, these kids cannot be dealt in any other way, so let's just throw them into any kind of program we can think of to see if they are actually, you know, rehabilitatable?
Tori, do you want to take this one?
So, I mean, basically, yeah, like I said, they do kind of have this sometimes birds of a feather mentality. So, and that goes into just like, it may not even be whether or not their parents are involved in drugs or their peers are involved in drugs, but possibly the neighborhood they come from, how they're doing in school, the likelihood of them being involved in drugs in the future. So, I mean, a lot of that is taken into account. And in terms of kids who are put in just because they're not successful in other programs, I mean, it's just like, well, you know, if that's usually going to be a juvenile who's high risk. So it's like, well, maybe having more supervision will help. And in this drug program, you're going to have more supervision. You're going to, you know, have more involvement with your family be required and stuff like that. So they're hoping, I mean, I would assume they're assuming, hey, maybe this will finally work, but from our results, it doesn't.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah, I guess if we had a second unsuspected result, it's kind of interesting that we even had groups to compare. You know, my thinking would be that if you have a drug need, you get drug services. If you don't have drug needs, you don't get drug services. But when it came to the 4 different groups, we had plenty of youth in each situation. I mean, clearly the youth without drug needs tended to get the conventional services, and the youth with the drug needs tended to get the drug services. But there were still lots of youth who didn't have drug needs, but who got drug services, and then still plenty of youth who had drug and alcohol needs, but who just received conventional services. So, you know, while we do talk about how, you know, these results aren't experimental. I mean, even if we had the ability to do an experimental study like this, I don't think we could randomly assign people to mismatched services.
Probably you wouldn't be able to, yeah. No, but it's a really curious finding. I would expect the matching to be a little bit better, but it seems that it's quite discretionary, actually.
Yeah, so there still seems to be a lot of discretion by the court itself to decide which youth they think receives the right kind of services. And when it comes to this court, they do use some risk assessment instruments, but I think the way the court tends to work is they only really do the risk assessment when they have a youth that they think is particularly risky. So it almost kind of becomes, you know, more of a proxy for, well, did you get the risk assessment instrument or not, as opposed to just being able to take each youth and say, okay, here are their individual risk level scores. But yeah, it definitely opens up this strange step where, I mean, for a lot of research, it's, well, let's look at recidivism and see what services we can provide and how people turn out. Because it is really difficult to understand why people think and do what they do and make their decisions. But if anything, I mean, I think a lot of this recidivism research also points out and says, yeah, these decision-making studies are also really necessary, because why is it that anyone receives the services that they receive?
Absolutely.
Great, so we have a minute left. So I'll leave it open if anyone else has any final thoughts or questions. Okay, well, with that, we are going to conclude this panel. I'd like to thank you all for coming and presenting your research, and for attendees for coming and asking great questions. I'm going to close out this session, so if you're looking to attend the next panel, you'll have to come back into this session. And thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, thank you.